Okay, let's get started. Sorry we're a little bit late, everyone. We are recording the session. Hopefully that button's worked. So welcome. I think this is our third, maybe fourth Small Business Mastery webinar. And the purpose is none of us could run our own businesses without the help of experts. So we are going to be joined by a wonderful expert today from Beneco. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. If you could just be on mute unless you want to ask a question or speak. Use the emojis if you hear something that you like. If you want to ask a question, please feel to pop the questions in the chat, but there will be some time at the end where you can unmute and ask whatever question you have. And without further ado, I will introduce myself. Hopefully a number of you know me. I'm Esther Coleman. I'm the co-founder of Seed HR along with Christy, and we help small to medium-sized businesses with all their HR needs to create amazing workplaces and high-performing teams. And so today, I've done the housekeeping. We're going to introduce Stephanie Borg from Beneco. Stephanie is a registered psychologist and her expertise is occupational rehabilitation. Beneco are our preferred suppliers, providers when we have clients and we help clients with workers' compensation claims. And their focus is really on injury prevention, but also recovery-focused strategies. We all know it's super beneficial if someone has a work-related injury or illness that we focus on that recovery and get them back to work as soon as possible. So Stephanie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Esther, and good afternoon all. Thank you for allowing us to have this opportunity to present today, and thank you for the warm intro as well. So as Esther mentioned, today I'm from a rehab provider, Beneco. An area that we really value and love supporting businesses on is all things injury prevention, as well as management. So in terms of today's presentation, I'd really like to share and cover some insights across these key areas today. Workers' compensation demystified, the particular focus on how we navigate this scheme. It can be quite complex. I know across the board, people working in the industry for years and years, there's still so much to learn and know. So it's particularly important for us to be across it, especially for those that aren't fully accustomed to, to working within the scheme, but equally across the stakeholders that are quite new to the scheme and the clients that we serve as well. The importance and value of recovery at work, not what it just means from a well-being perspective, but also a financial one for businesses especially. What end-to-end return to work and or case management looks like, what the gold standard is and how we can all work together in kind of chipping away at that sort of objective. But also looking at the alternative pathway to return to work, where in some instances, for some individuals, returning back to their their pre-injury role is not sustainable or nor it's appropriate. What does that other kind of pathway look like, and how do we sort of work together in achieving that? As well as, ending on the culture of prevention. So hopefully by the end of today, we've covered some strategies and some insights on the injury management space. But equally, if not more important, what does prevention look like? So we don't maybe have to go through steps 1 to 5. We can go through prevention to mitigate any sort of risks in the workplace. Okay, so sorry, I might just put my... So some key players within this space that we either are aware of or have directly worked alongside with current or previous claims are, of course, our employers, allied health professionals, and allied health professionals from an array of different fields. So quite interestingly, what actually gets approved within the scheme might not be the common standard that we're all familiar with. So we can share some insights on that. Our NTD, so our nominated treating doctor, or for other states, our GP. Us, like Beneco, rehab providers, what role do we play within this kind of scene? Our insurer or the agents acting on behalf of the insurance, and of course our workers who have been injured. Okay, so we'll go
I think
into
I'll have to change the slides for you, Steph, just so it's not by magic.
Yeah, if that's okay, thank you. So in terms of going through what each role each party or stakeholder plays for the employer, as we know, there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of regulations and policies around good, safe, healthy work, but there is a duty of care as businesses to make sure that we're all providing health, safety, and work that I guess complements and is aligned with our staff's welfare and well-being. It's about providing workers with adequate information on their return to work, as well as compensation procedures. Notification is super important, so notifying Safe Work immediately of any serious incidents, particularly those involving fatality or serious injury, as well as your day-to-day injuries that unfortunately do happen, irrespective of the industry or state that we work within. But for all of those injuries, making sure that we're reporting them within 48 hours of being notified. And really importantly here, making sure that we're providing suitable employment as available to our injured workers who have the capacity to work. And we'll go into what that kind of looks like shortly. Worker obligations. So when it comes to the reporting piece, they need to notify their employer as soon as possible at the onset of an injury. Really important here, but they need to participate actively in their injury management plan. So the way that the scheme is designed is that each worker will receive an IMP, and that basically pinpoints what each person's role is, including theirs, and how we're all collectively working together to achieve return to work and recovery outcomes. So it's quite a comprehensive list, but it gets that sort of buy-in, or I guess that endorsement from everyone that's involved in that kind of care management. Nominating a GP, so they are in their right to select their GP. Most will obviously choose an existing GP, that's usually their family doctor, but in some instances that's not always the case if that GP doesn't work within the scheme, and they may need to find someone else. Make reasonable efforts to return to work in either suitable or pre-injury employment or with another employer. And this really comes down to their capacity. So each month, they are getting their capacity reviewed by their GP or their NTD. And if there is capacity that's documented and agreed by those treatment professionals, then it really is the worker's obligation to work towards that when there is capacity. Where it gets a little bit murky is where we can sometimes see claims or, some recovery trajectories where there's long-standing nil capacity, and it's quite difficult to navigate that. But equally, what's difficult is actually to get that worker on board with some sort of a return to work plan. So hopefully we can cover what that might look like and what angles and strategies we can take in those instances as well. And ultimately cooperate fully with the insurer in respect to their claim and comply with any reasonable requests to provide information. So one example here, again, just going back to the stagnation on a claim that can happen more often than not, where a client doesn't maybe have capacity and that's been sort of extended for months and months. Being involved and actively participating in certain medical appointments and assessments, just to make sure that what their treatment party is saying is actually congruent with what unbiased and one-off independent medical professionals are saying also. Thanks, Esther. Our NTD/GP obligations, ultimately they're a coordinator for the overall recovery of the worker. As much as we all have a role to play as stakeholders, arguably the GP plays a really heavy one. They're in a high position of power when it comes to documenting capacities and really giving clearance and paving the way for what the next step, what does the next week, what does the next month look like for that person's recovery and their return to work goals. They're guiding treatment, which is best suited for that person or their client's condition. They're making sure that they're providing comprehensive and accurate certification to highlight capacity. And I guess one of the shortcomings is most of the time when there's case conferences, when there's these monthly reviews with their client or the injured worker, they're really basing their medical opinion on the information at hand. So we can sort of see at times when when the gears aren't working together, when the stakeholders aren't actively being forthcoming with information and sharing information, this can actually sometimes throw a spanner in the works. A key example here is maybe if an injured worker is, involved in both treatment with an exercise physiologist and psychologist, they're not speaking with a GP. The client's coming in with their GP for review, and there's no kind of update on capacity. What I would like to share as well is there is a lot of work being done within the scheme in terms of guidelines. Ultimately, the vision of the scheme involves that all stakeholders are working together in unity with the ultimate goal of achieving positive return to work and recovery outcomes. What the evidence does tell us is that when there's shared goals, communication and cooperation among all those stakeholders in the support team, this is actually the needle mover. This is critical in improving clinical and occupational outcomes for the worker. So as a result, there are key provisions in place. So, and this is all available online, but there's a guidelines for the provision of relevant services. This kind of puts in place what each person's obligation is. Further to that, even with the treating parties. So what tends to happen is, depending on the scheme and state, I know in New South Wales, I used to do work as a psychologist within the scheme. We do require CIRA training. So it's not enough just to have your clinical profession in that field, but we also have to undergo a CIRA accreditation to actually work within that space. And the whole purpose of that is not to kind of test us how we are as a psychologist, but actually test how we're going to use our clinical skills and our expertise within a return to work scheme. And that's where we get those allied health treatment requests. So it's really getting each treatment party to showcase, well, what are the goals of the treatment? What are your objectives? How are you going to get this client back in terms of some sort of functioning capacity? And that's kind of echoed in some of these points as well. We've got to make sure that the treatment parties are providing reasonably necessary treatment. Now, that's something that does get investigated and determined by the insurer or the agent. But typical ones that we would likely see on claims are when a client's receiving treatment with a physiotherapist, an EP, a psychologist. Now, ones that we might not see so much with a chiropractor, with an osteopath, clients receiving treatment via remedial massage and acupuncture. And I guess the point to stress here, to my last one, placebo is recognized as treatment. Sometimes what's really crucial is understanding that, yes, there are evidence-based treatments. There's treatment backed by empirical research and evidence. But ultimately, what really matters is what's the client's self-reporting of that treatment. Because it's all good and well for a client to tick a box and, receive gold standard EP treatment. But the question lies, is that the best treatment for them with their niche recovery trajectory? Or are they self-reporting benefits through remedial massage? And again, this is where sometimes you will see whether you have so already or not, but it could be a future thing, where sometimes you might see the insurer actually approving some of these other types of treatment, like osteopathy or remedial massage. And that's really what it comes down to. It comes down to if the client is actually reporting subjective benefits, and we can see that being mapped out, or I guess complemented in an upgrade sort of pathway on their certificate, well, then the insurer will look at that as, well, that's a positive thing. So why are we going to stop something that's actually working for that client within that particular circumstance? But ultimately, regardless of that treatment modality, they do need to have that outcome focused, and it does very much need to be in alignment with the return to work objective. Another one thing that we sort of see pop up in questions with employers and businesses that we work with is hours when they're booking appointments. It really is, it's not quite a black or white answer to give, to be honest. Ultimately, the general rule of thumb is, obviously, if our clients are not at work or they're not performing suitable duties, then there would be an expectation of that injured worker to obviously receive that treatment or attend that appointment outside of their work hours. So on a Thursday, if they're working Monday to Wednesday, Where it gets a little bit tricky is obviously if they're back on their pre-injury hours. And if their pre-injury hours are full-time hours, and there's limitations with the treatment provider working on weekends, for example, this is where we might need to kind of come to the party a little bit and sort of recognize, okay, well, maybe, and this is where the rehab provider would come in as well, where we'd say, look, Bob, we understand you're working full-time, pre-injury hours, so that we're not kind of disrupting your work routine and your business, but also making sure that you're getting the treatment that you need so you can do more in the coming weeks at work. Why don't we sort of set a goal of a morning appointment? So it's not disrupting your work routine. And as soon as you finish that appointment, you're coming into your shift for the rest of the day. So there are sort of workarounds in that regard. But yeah, I suppose it's important to kind of be aware of. The value of recovery at work, so some Safe Work Australia findings overall, and it's kind of cross-comparing psychological versus physical claims. In terms of trends, what we've seen from 2021 to 23 on the psych front is a 19.2% increase of psychological claims. What's concerning is that over 10 years, the claim count of psychological injuries has doubled. What we see in physical claims, though, is not necessarily as sharp of an increase in those claims, but nevertheless, the claim count is growing, albeit sort of at a slower kind of pace. In terms of time off work, we do start to see more of a difference between those psych versus physical claims. So again, looking at a similar timestamp from 21 to 22, those sustaining a psychological injury on average had a 34.2 weeks time loss. So that means that's quite a considerable amount of time that person's in sustaining that injury, being at home and not being returned to any type of work, whether it be alternative employment or suitable employment. And that's quite different compared to our physical injuries, where we typically see more of that sort of time loss at the 8 working week mark. Kind of begs some questions. Is it, are we sort of saying that psych claims are more complex? Why is it that they're longer? Or are there maybe potentially external factors contributing to this sort of time loss? So are businesses well equipped at managing the psych-related injuries as opposed to physical? And what does that look like? So there's a whole array of different factors that can kind of influence this narrative. And you'll see later on in the presentation, I'll go into some examples, but also some strategies as well. And costs. Psych claims generally have a higher claim cost due to longer durations, but what we typically see is across the board, physical claims have a more frequent total cost. It's larger, despite their claim cost being lower. So there's more frequent physical claims. So overall, the claim cost is higher if we're comparing physical to psych. But each individual case, a psych claim would be more costly and more time consuming. Above and beyond this, what the research tells us is those that tend to have the worst recovery and rehabilitation outcomes are actually those that have sustained a primary physical injury and then have developed a secondary psych injury, more than psych claims alone, which is quite interesting. What we know about work, and again, everyone coming online after potentially a long weekend, sometimes we do sort of, lift our feet and we have to have that shower to get that motivation to be at work. We're all there, we've all been there, but ultimately being at work gives us that purpose, right? We know it, despite sometimes having those days where we'd like to have maybe a half day off. What the evidence always points to and continuously shows us is that unemployment is bad for us physically and mentally, as well as having negative impacts on our life expectancy. Return to work improves all these things. For injured people, work is actually their therapy. It's what promotes their recovery alongside the clinical treatment that they're receiving. It minimizes the effects of long-term work absence. It can reduce chronic disability, poverty, and social exclusion, leading to ultimately better health and quality of life outcomes. In terms of early return to work, so if we're now looking at the claims experience and, why do we all jump in early? Why do I keep on getting that call from that rehab provider or my broker or the insurance agent? Why are they down my throat? Why are they constantly ringing and messaging me when there's a claim? Well, we know that early return to work, it expedites the worker's recovery. It maintains links within the workplace. So again, if we're looking at some of these factors here, these are sometimes the factors that can contribute, or I guess partially influence somebody with a primary physical injury developing a secondary psych. And I don't need to go into explaining that further, why it's so crucial to kind of mitigate those things, because they're actually the cohort that have the worst rehab outcomes. So if we're maintaining that link with the workplace, what we start to kind of hear as the external party outside of the business or outside of the employer's end is the worker actually saying, oh, I actually feel supported. I feel like my employer, they're checking in with me, they're reaching out. So it's all of those little nuances that can make a difference in the long term. It reduces social exclusion and risk of separation from their work routine and daily habits, improves quality of life and well-being. It avoids loss of workplace productivity, so employers have the opportunity to retain their skilled workers rather than going through that unknown transition where maybe somebody, one of their staff members have sustained an injury, they are at capacity, we don't quite know what their return to work plan is, they're sitting at home, do I rehire? What does it look like getting them back? So it's navigating all of those kind of intricacies. The sooner we can get them back in some sort of suitable duties, well, it not only helps that worker's recovery, but also to help the employer in terms of forecasting and really getting a good gauge on how they're kind of tracking with that re-entry into some type of work. The worker maintains their exact wage, and it reduces risk of long-term disability. Now, it really is defined as recover at work, not return to work. And the reason being is there's a lot of evidence that supports workplace-based rehab. And I guess that's probably the main rationale why rehab providers exist. We're not here to kind of support clients after they've recovered and then returning to work, because we know that returning to work is part of their recovery. So it's more effective in reducing perceived pain and disability, improving function capabilities and preventing further disability. So the sooner we're getting them to recover at work, but it also improves psychosocial barriers related to separating from that work routine. For a return to work program to be successful, it requires a lot of things, but ultimately the employer to make early and meaningful contact with the injured worker and maintaining that regular communication. And there's a slide coming up on that. That first impression really makes a difference. And we also want to make sure that necessary communication isn't broken down at any point or along the way. Good to know, employees can actually choose their own rehab provider of choice. So that is a right that they can kind of select and have that discussion with their nominated insurer. But yeah, just going back to that sort of early and meaningful contact. Not sure if those online have heard this terminology before, or perhaps witnessed or seen it in some of their staff members, but there's a large concept around perceived injustice. And again, this is going back to, and you can see how it's quite aligned within a scheme kind of paradigm where I've been done wrong at work, I've got this injury, now what? And what the research actually tells us is the injury is one thing, it's the perceived treatment. And I guess if you like the systemic level scenarios and strategies or lack of, that really paves the way for somebody developing a sense of injustice, again, potentially contributing to those secondary psych-related claims that we can see popping up. So I guess why I'm turning to that is that first impression, what we see on our end is if those communications aren't being had correctly. And when I say correctly, I do say that with caution, because most of the time we don't come across employers that want to be narky and they want to make it difficult because they know it's in their interest to work together. The more we're hot-headed and hard-headed, it doesn't work for either party. So most of the time, it's not what we see is not necessarily the employer choosing to not communicate, or sometimes they're just not sure. Especially with the psych-related claims, when do I intervene? When is it appropriate? When am I overstepping? And that uncertainty from the employer, as you can see, is really not coming from an ill place or a bad intention. But unfortunately, it can be misread by that worker. which can then pave that way of that kind of injustice experience. So we'll go into a little bit of a scenario of that in the coming slides. Thanks, Esther. I think we've all maybe come across, or there's some nods if we've come across these sort of statistics. And I think the provider continuously does this research every year, and it tends to sort of not change. Time off work and that link between likelihood of return to work, it's huge. 20 days, 70%, 50 days on top of that is half, 35% likelihood of return to work. So getting in early and all being involved in that kind of process, does have that kind of strong significance in terms of the positive return to work outcomes. So I'll go on to the end-to-end return to work piece, what it looks like for all of us. As mentioned before, I probably can't stress this enough, but that initial discussion or needs assessment, if you like, is really crucial. And again, it's not expecting the employer to be the psychologist, to have the therapist hat on, but just providing that point of, or I guess that place of support, listening and really note-taking and documenting what the worker's concerns or what that reported injury is. Explaining your role to them in that piece, that transparency of information, it kind of sets the stage in terms of expectations from here moving forward, what that kind of relationship looks like. Providing a lot of information education. As I mentioned in the start of the slides, I think within this scheme, even the greatest of professionals are continuously learning new things with the rapid changes and the uncertainty. So can only imagine those injured workers that have not signed up to work in this scheme. If we're getting sometimes still a bit confused, we can only imagine what their experience is like. So making sure that as best as possible, we're really providing that information on the work cover scheme, what it looks like, that mutual obligation, so setting that kind of trust, but also having that assertiveness to reset expectations, really getting consent from the worker at that point, and discussing those next steps, and really one of those pivotal ones being that current certificate that will then pave the way for that kind of claim initiation. Looking and reviewing available suitable duties. Now, some businesses might have an in-house record in the way of like a job dictionary, but if not, there are external supports such as rehab providers that will go in, and I'll cover that soon, and do a comprehensive assessment of what might be available. Creating positive expectations and reporting through the relevant business channels as per your company's policy and regulations. Workplace assessments. So once that injury has been sustained, claim lodged, you would receive a referral from a rehab provider. This is where we'll essentially do a comprehensive evaluation of that pre-injury workplace for that particular staff member. Irrespective if it's physical or psychological, obviously if it's physical, there'll be a physical-based consultant, so that would usually be a physiotherapist or an EP, versus a psychological injury, which would be conducted by a rehab counselor or psychologist, and they would be assessing cognitive demands of the role as opposed to the physical ones. But a key point of this assessment is also identifying suitable duties. Now, for some individuals, depending on the nature of the injury and depending on the nature of work available, sometimes the suitable duties might actually be quite different to what that person's pre-injury role was. Now, if that's the case, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing for an employer to sort of see that. The rehab provider will work really closely with you in sort of paving the way as to how we're going to get Bob to go from C and D back to A and B, which is quite different. But again, if we touch on that research again, it really comes down to the being in some sort of work is always going to triumph being in not at work at all. So sometimes if you do get those referrals or those suggestions that, okay, well, Bob's usually working with clients and he's usually on the road, but Stephanie from Beneco is recommending, maybe work from home or printing or data reporting, we can see why. It could be that due to the cognitive or the physical demands of that pre-injury role, that might actually make Bob, that might delay his return to work. So if we're aiming for that goal, that might not be activated until maybe 2 months, whereas maybe goal B might actually get Bob into some sort of work next week. Next one. Recover at work plan. So once those suitable duties have been identified, it will be mapped out on a ROP, we call them, a recover at work plan. I guess the key function of this is to confirm and present what the return to work plan is, and it's shared equally with all stakeholders. So the good thing here is that it's not only mapping out the stage for stage one, but it'll typically give you multiple stages, so we can all kind of see with full transparency how Bob's going to go from maybe doing some light suitable duties to actually getting back into that pre-injury role. And it's also signed and reviewed by your stakeholders as well. So as an employer, there is that peace of mind that you are getting that, not only the rehab providers backing, but you're also getting their GPs back in, that this is all supportive and safe for them to do. So as mentioned, they're either a modified version of the worker's pre-injury duties, or sometimes those suitable duties can be something that's not typically part of their pre-injury role. Again, the key really is getting them into some type of work to get them to stay engaged. It also helps to keep the worker, keeping the worker engaged can also, depending on your premium model, minimize the workers' compensation premiums, which ultimately has that financial benefit to a business. But that obviously depends on which model your company falls under. And what we know is that it prevents this prolonged absence, which can lead to higher insurance costs overall and expenses related to recruitment, things like hiring and training, if we're looking at replacing staff. The good thing with suitable duties also is that most of the time, if we go back to those doctor reviews or the allied health professional feedback, they can only give their clinical opinion, but what really matters is actually testing that capacity. So it's one thing for the EP or the psychologist to say, well, Bob should be able to do X, Y, Z, but no one's going to fully endorse that, support it, or confirm it until Bob's in there doing it. And the suitable duties will also give you that evidence for all stakeholders, especially for rehab providers, to go back into that next case conference and say, well, look, Bob actually managed to do those XYZ tasks really well. This is going to set the stage for that next kind of stage of the upgrade. It really is a collective effort. Each stakeholder plays a crucial role in establishing a return to work plan. Employers really do in that kind of position of power. And I'll give an example. A colleague of mine, this was years back now, he was doing a workplace assessment. He had some really good ideas for suitable duties, but due to this worker's disability and their current capacities, even those suitable duties that he could see on the work site were still not going to be appropriate. What really moved the needle was the employer's feedback. A couple of days later, the employer rang and said, look, I know you came out on site for those couple of hours the other day, but one thing you didn't get to see was we have another work site 5 minutes down the road. They've got some available suitable duties. So the key here is that as an employer, you actually have more information about the workplace than we do. We're coming in for maybe an hour or 2 hours, and although we do a comprehensive assessment and we really try to understand the workplace, ultimately you guys hold the key that unlocks many doors, especially if we're looking at suitable duties. So in this particular instance, had that employer not been able to creatively identify a niche suitable duty that would never have been picked up in a workplace assessment, then this worker would have remained off work for probably another 2 months. That employer call and that employer feedback actually meant that that worker had a review, I think, a few days after. They were back at work the following week. So that insight and that awareness from the employer is really crucial. It's working together. Yeah. Alternative pathways. Maybe a raise of hands if we've had some claims transfer to this kind of phase of one's return to work. Can't see any. So within the scheme, we do follow a work of a hierarchy, if you like. And the idea is, ultimately to get a person that's been injured at work back to meaningful work, but as closely aligned to what they were doing. And that's why this hierarchy has been developed, such that our number one goal is obviously to get that person back to their pre-injury role, so their same role with their same employer. If that's not appropriate due to medical reasons, then the next down of that hierarchy would be, well, what's maybe an alternative role with that same employer? Because again, if we're looking at what's going to be the most reasonable, the most streamlined kind of return to work transition for them, then arguably getting them back into the role that they're employed within or the company that they work in is always going to be a lot quicker than looking for alternative employment with a new company. If, however, sometimes that's also not achievable, then the next list would actually be looking at a similar or same role with a new employer. This is something that we would typically see more so with psych-related injuries, where most of the time we would typically see a bullying or harassment claim. And from that, the key restriction might be that they can't work with a certain department or colleague that is very company specific as opposed to role specific, which means that if it's Stephanie working as a psychologist, she can't work as a psychologist with Beneco because person A, but there's nothing stopping her from working as a psychologist with this new company. So arguably that would be the most streamlined return to work goal. But then in other cases, going at the bottom of that hierarchy, sometimes working for the same company and for that same role is completely off the cards due to the nature of the injury, which is where that sort of last goal on the hierarchy would be a new company and a new role. So the reason why there is that hierarchy is that we want to make it the most streamlined and the most comparative to what that injured workers come in with in terms of their skills, their experience. So when we sort of see a goal change, a rehab goal change to new employer, it typically means that we've really dotted our I's, crossed our T's, we've provided suitable duties, or we absolutely can't. And this is why now we're proceeding with new employment. Yeah. So in terms of new employment, probably a key thing to note is we shouldn't, as businesses, we shouldn't go in that default mode of this might be in the too hard basket, I'm going to go straight to new employer. We have seen some instances in the past where unfortunately legal can get involved if businesses aren't correctly and it's not fully documented and there hasn't been genuine efforts and attempts to actually get that person back to their substantive position. It can bite businesses back later. So it's always good first, refer to that hierarchy. And if, of course, I's dotted, T's crossed, it's not achievable, new employer would be the next goal. Ultimately here, a vocational assessment would be completed. The rehab provider would be working closely with that client with job seeking efforts. There are a lot of work cover placements and incentives to kind of support clients with reasonable resources like aids. Sometimes there's host employer financial benefits to businesses onboarding somebody or giving them training opportunities. So there's a lot of things that we have up our sleeve to kind of support those clients transition if it is, of course, reasonable to new employment. Prevention. Proactive behavior will always triumph over reactive behavior. I think the bottom line is that there are obviously a lot of supports in place. There's a lot of regulated systems and resources and processes that we follow to make sure that we're all doing our part effectively and safely when it comes to injury management. But wouldn't it be great if we could all just focus on prevention so we don't see those claims coming in and everything Stephanie just said we don't even have to think about. So we'll go over a couple of examples of what some of our customers are currently doing. These might be some things that you guys do in your sort of teams as well, just to kind of look at that prevention side now. So in terms of physical injuries, a lot of things can be done, pre-employment screenings. Sometimes businesses will externally refer one-off risk assessments and safety audits. Alternatively, some businesses, the larger ones, will have an in-house safety WHS team. But rest assured, if that's not available or it's not financially feasible for a smaller business, these are one-off services that can be completed by an external provider. Job dictionaries can be really handy. So a job dictionary, in essence, is a Bible of multiple workplace assessments for a certain department or a certain business. Why that's good is that you as a business then have documented information on every single role of your company, the physical demands that are attributed to each of those roles and breakdown of tasks, duties. And what that also serves as, it serves as a tool where you can easily go back to if there is somebody that's injured to refer and say, okay, well, based on physical demands, they can't do this, but they can do that. So it can kind of fast track if a claim was to arise. A lot of training offerings, manual handling training and ergonomic assessments tend to be quite popular ones among businesses, again, depending on the workforce and the industry. One we see a lot is fitness for work assessments. This is huge. I think it's a lot of unknown turf for many businesses. How do we navigate? You know, we're not talking about a compensable injury now. We're talking about a staff member that has a condition that is absolutely not related to the workplace. How do I manage that as a business? As an employer, I've got, on the one hand, I've got to wear my duty of care hat. I have to provide safe and reasonable supports. But equally, in terms of obligation, this quite doesn't fall under my realm because this didn't happen within my workplace. So fitness for works are really helpful. It can be conducted in-house or externally. It can be based on an array of different conditions, from chronic to acute, psychological to physical. But essentially, it will basically give you an assessment of a person's actual capacity in light of their non-compensable condition, as well as give you tailored recommendations. And as an employer, it does give you that kind of peace of mind. Based on this assessment, can Bob do his normal role, irrespective of this non-compensable injury or condition? Does Bob need some modifications? If Bob does need modifications, is this reasonable and logistically possible within my business? So it then helps, I guess, pave that way as an employer. What's my next step? So a lot is involved with them, but they can be quite helpful, especially if these things have either popped up during one's employment or perhaps maybe hasn't been fully disclosed. And I want to end with touching on psychological injuries. I find from my experience that does tend to be more of the unknown to businesses. They're less overt. So if we can't see them, how do we detect them? How do we control them? There is a lot of resources online, but key things to note that I'd like to share are across the board, there are 6 psychosocial hazards in the workplace, and they really come down to these 6 metrics here. Demands, controls, supports, relationships, role, and change. Now, these are really crucial. What the research tells us is if a business is adequately watering these plants, filling the cups of all of these 6 psychosocial hazards, then that business is psychologically safe. It means that that business is most likely going to mitigate any future psychological risks or hazards. And we'll go into some examples of that in the next slide. Yeah. So key things to look at, and again, from a prevention point, but these might also be some things that you could ask during a claims process. So again, if we're looking at trying to it's prevention within management. So if we're looking at maybe preventing a secondary psych from unfolding at the back end of a physical injury, these might be some questions or I guess tools that, you as managers or leaders might want to kind of have as a little checklist or a toolkit. So when we're thinking of demands, it's simply the workload demands. The research tells us if the demands are too high, it's likely to result in burnt out staff. What's interesting is if they're too low, you're also going to get disengaged staff. So it's finding that happy medium. But yeah, key questions: is your workload achievable? Are the deadlines realistic? Have you had enough training and support to manage these demands? Controls is actually looking at how passive versus active they feel in their role and decisions made about them. So do you feel involved in those decisions about your role, anything upcoming or that have previously taken place? But also, do you feel your skills are being put to good use? This is key because, again, it's finding that happy medium. If people don't feel like their skills are being put to good use, they're less likely to feel like their workload is meaningful and purposeful, and you can get that withdrawal. Equally, too high on that, they can feel burnt out. Support's probably a no-brainer here, but again, I kind of feel like when it comes to the supports and relationships, we all know this. You don't have to be a psychologist to know this, but how often do we do it? How often is it actually incorporated in our BAU? And I think that's where the gap lies. Again, it's not that intention, but it's that resource or that time thing. So having those opportunities, do you know who to talk to for support? Are there opportunities for you to express your concerns? There's a lot of quick wins that businesses can do. I know here we do like workload check-ins. So once weekly, it's almost like each consultant in our business does a vibe check. So they do a scaling system from 1 to 10 each week. Tell us where you're at. How are you feeling? You tell me. So the control's in your court, and then we'll allocate work and referrals and so not according to that as well. Relationships. Have you experienced any unacceptable behavior? So again, if we're looking at the claims piece, especially for psychological claims, it's not always the case where it's the worker and their direct manager. Sometimes it's the colleagues, and this is where it can be that unknown turf, because as a leader, we might not be fully across all of those intricacies with the day-to-day interactions across departments or across colleagues and teams. So having that platform to kind of ask those questions. And do you feel the business is open and transparent? Is there trust in these kind of relationships that we've got in the workplace? Role, are your responsibilities made clear to you? Are you aware of what success looks like? When this isn't made clear, they can feel defeated, deflated. It can lead to anxiety and stress. So making sure there's that kind of transparency. And change. Do you feel the business manages change well? Do you feel well informed with any changes at work? Because with any business, especially small to medium businesses, rapid growth and change is definitely on the trend. It's on the uphill, and making sure that we're checking with our staff at those points, because Bob might be feeling well supported, and fully across his role from last month, but with that change, is he still feeling that same way? What we want to avoid is this kind of scenario as leaders. Hey, Bob, how are you doing? Not so good. Please complete this report by end of day. And again, it's not something that we have the ill intention of doing. Most of the time, we just don't know, like, where's my boundary? How much can I say? How much can I not say? So again, if I could stress on any of the psychological aspects, I don't think that we as leaders are terrible at it. I think there's a gap, and most of the time we're not really having that platform to do those things. So hopefully some of those questions that we can ask, if ever we're in a situation like this, or we have been and we reflect on it, we can maybe throw in some questions in that blank quadrant to Bob. So we're not telling him to do his report, but maybe that check-in. And I guess the key thing here, what's really concerning when it comes to that culture of prevention from a psych perspective, is over a 3-year time point. This is research conducted, by, it was a meta-analysis that's conducted year on year across Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian cohorts, workplaces. And what they found was, over time, workers are actually moving away from internal supports in the workplace. If they're going through a concern, a problem, an issue, they're more so moving towards external support. So the yellow is family and friends, and you can see the blue being manager, and the green colleagues. So you can see that that's shrinking over time. We're less likely as workers, as staff members, to actually reach out for internal in the workplace support. So the more we need to kind of, I guess, work towards shifting this dialogue. And it really starts with those day-to-day conversations. The more we sort of set up that platform, the more likely they're going to be transparent with us, and the better placed we are going to be as leaders to kind of detect, oh, something's not right here. How can we mitigate this risk? How can we prevent a potential claim from arising? I think I've done okay for time for some questions.
Yeah,
maybe.
that's really good.
I was looking at the time.
Please feel free to put questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask some questions. Does anyone have any burning questions to begin? Sorry, I can't see everyone. It's a bit tricky. All I can see is my screen at the moment.
Oh, I'm just checking. I can't see any
Any questions? Well, we have Steph.
I'd be interested. Oh, is that a...
Sorry, it's Steph.
Yep.
Sorry, just got an echo. I was just wondering how you recommend we talk to other colleagues and staff when there's somebody who's off with a workers' comp claim, be it psychosocial or, I mean, physical's a little bit easier, but especially in psychosocial, that whole kind of what we tell the rest of the group, because often we work in, you know, smallish groups or not. Have you got any recommendations about how you handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where it does get really tricky because there's no hard and firm correct answer. I always say that the best kind of approach to take is have that conversation with the worker on claim. So what does communication look like for you? How would you like me to share or not share information? So again, giving them that sort of opportunity to report back to you and say, because most of the time you would actually be surprised. Most of them will actually say, look, I'm happy for you to disclose. I understand I'm probably going to be off for the next 4 weeks. Happy for you to share X, Y, Z. So there's a way that we can still be transparent enough that serves a function to the wider business, but not so much where it has to kind of over divulge their, you know, that person's personal circumstance, if that makes sense. But I think, yeah, that initial discussion is really crucial in the follow-up. And I agree with you that the psych-related claims tend to be the tricky ones. But again, even setting that expectation, well, what does supportive communication look like to you? Because again, most of the time there's no one quick answer that is gold standard and it's a blanket that can be applied to, you know, every single staff member off work on site claims. So yeah, asking them the question, because honestly what we see working alongside you guys and seeing that claim and the, you know, the referral comes on to us is most of the time they're actually feeling frustrated that they haven't heard from the employer. And again, we're providing that education, but hang on, they're probably unsure if they're maybe speaking too much, or, you know, so setting that expectation is crucial because most of them, they'll welcome it. You know, I actually liked how my leader, you know, they're going to check in with me once a month, a 5-minute call. You know, they appreciate that.
Thank you. Christy has a question in the chat, which I know as a team we often experience. What happens when an injured worker fails to provide a medical certificate or certificate capacity or stops communicating with the business regularly? Do you come across this much?
Yeah, so I suppose on our, like when there's rehab involved, it does sometimes make it a bit easier in a sense that you've got somebody external going to the case conferences and getting the certificates. But look, nevertheless, these things can happen. The recommendation really would be having the conversation with the insurance case manager, getting the IMP updated, so that injury management plan. So it's resetting those expectations. So I suppose the quick answer to this is there are strategies, there are obligations. So the worker has their own obligations, one being actually contributing and providing medical certificates. It can actually have financial consequences to the worker as well. So if that medical certificate isn't updated or supplied, it can have an impact on their weekly benefits being paid. Yeah, so we typically wouldn't see it that much because there is a bit of a consequence to that person. But yeah, the communicating, it is a tricky one. I would say if we're setting it up early, Christy, from the get-go, this is what communication looks like. Let's what's the workaround? What's going to work for you and me? I've had some really tricky ones where interestingly, what tends to work is case conferencing with the other treaters. So even me as the external rehab provider, I'm not the employer, I'm here to help, you know, sometimes we'll have episodes where clients won't want to reach out, or they'll go through a phase of, you know, MIA, sorry, no communication. And then we'll sort of arrange a call maybe with their psychologist or their EP. Hey, can we get an update? And again, what's really helpful is the treatment provider you as the employer are giving that kind of, we're actually wanting to help. Like, can we hear from you? What's going to work? And we're coming from a support place, you know. Sometimes the conferencing with the client as well can be really important too. Yeah, if they're treatment providers involved.
Thank you. And thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions. And I think the key takeaways for me is the differences in that recovery time with psych and physical. Work is healthy for us, and getting back to work is healthy, and obviously that proactive prevention piece. So thank you so much, Stephanie. Round of applause for you for sharing your knowledge. If you want to connect with Stephanie or learn more about what Beneco do, please reach out. They've got such a wealth of knowledge in this area. And just before we go, our next session, we've squeezed an extra one in because I know there've been some interesting case laws in the industrial relations arena, and certainly we're getting a lot of questions around salaried employees and annualized wage agreements after this big underpayment issue that has been happening with some of the big supermarket chains. So we're going to ask Bridget to come and talk to us in terms of small business owners, how we can best avoid those. And she's a partner at Addison's. So we hope to see you all next time. And thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks, Esther. Thank you all.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.